today's Energy Central webcast entitled, How to Deliver a World-Class Demand Management Program, Lessons from the Field. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. I'm happy now to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Robert Duvall. Robert, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to first of all thank Energy Central for pulling together this webcast. We've got, I think, a good presentation for the group here. I've not seen the makeup of the audience, but I'm assuming we have hopefully a lot of utility clients on board, probably some consultants, and also we probably have some vendors as well that provide these types of services. So welcome to everybody on board. I'm going to start off by introducing our speakers, and then we'll jump into the presentation. My name is Robert Duvall. No relation to the actor. I am the Senior Director of Program Administration for Converge. My team provide tech services, call center services, manage our fleet, our safety programs, central support teams for Converge programs around the country. Before I came to Converge, I worked for Investor-Owned Utilities, Florida Power and Light, and Southern Company for about 15 years. I ran the National Good Sense program at Southern Company, so I worked with a lot of utilities there, and I have a degree in engineering from Georgia Tech. Our second speaker will be Julie Prince. Julie Prince has been with the company for about 3 years now. She runs our central support team, and she will walk through areas that central support teams would normally provide in a programs of these types. Before joining Converge, she worked at the apartment guide for 13 years and was the product operations manager there before coming over to Converge. And Julie, like myself, are also proud grandparents of a grandson and a granddaughter. And then we saved our smartest speaker for last, by far. We have Pablo Buelawan, a PhD from the city of Fort Collins. Pablo leads the Fort Collins Load Management and Demand Response programs and is also a member of the Advanced Meter Fort Collins Management Team. Before coming to Fort Collins, he was a staff scientist at the Argentinian Atomic Energy Commission and went to the Buenos Aires University and specialized in nuclear physics and astrophysics. So, as I mentioned, we saved the smartest guy for last here. Next slide, please. So I want to cover really kind of 8 key areas here for for today's webinars. And these are going to kind of follow the order of the actual presentation itself. The first thing we're going to talk about is, as a utility company, what type of options do you have available to deliver a demand response program? Once you've made that decision, there's some things you need to go through. One of those is obviously hiring or bringing on field technicians in order to implement the programs. You need to put together processes in place to install the load control devices, which are typically going to be DCUs and thermostats in a residential program. You want to set up some scorecards and metrics to make sure that your vendor is performing properly and meeting your overall metrics. With these types of programs, it involves a lot of truck rolls, and so you want to make sure that you have a good safety program in place and that you have safe drivers on the road. You also want to make sure that these programs are very cost effective for you and you run these efficiently to minimize cost. There are some other elements to these programs, such as program support and customer care, that are also very important. And then the last topic we'll cover will be data management and exchanging data between the utility company and their vendor. We will then jump into a case study that Pablo will kind of walk through what Fort Collins did in terms of using these types of topics. Next slide, please. So as a utility, there's really 3 options you have if you want to deploy any type of large-scale DR type program. The first option that utilities will consider is, do we do this ourselves? Can we use our internal staff to actually implement these programs? And that'll work very well for smaller programs, for pilot programs. A lot of electric co-ops, for example, have deployed their own programs where they would install, say, a water heater and install a load control switch on that water heater, and they would use their internal people for that work. However, on the downside of that, in many cases, utilities do not have excess capacity. People are already busy, and they don't have the resources really needed or the skill sets in some case needed to run one of these types of programs. So internal resources is one option that may fit, particularly for smaller programs. Another common option is to go out and hire local HVAC contractors to do the work for you. They're already in the area, they understand the technology standpoint, and they already have a presence in the local market. So there's certainly some benefits of doing that. However, HVAC contractors, they have lulls throughout the year, and they also have very busy times. In the summer times, for example, they are out, servicing HVAC units and replacing HVAC units. And if they can go out and replace a $5,000 HVAC system versus installing a low control switch, the replacement will normally win that. And so there may be issues in the summertime when your HVAC vendors may not really have the capacity available to perform the work that you as a utility want them to do. And then the third option that's available is to go out and hire what I'll call a turnkey provider. And there's a lot of people out there in the market that do this, Converge being one of those. And these turnkey providers typically have done this before. They have the resources in place. They know what's involved in running these types of programs. And so that can also be a good option. However, when you select a third-party provider, you are entering into a long-term relationship with this provider who will be interacting very closely with your customers. And so it's very important if you go this route that you do your due diligence and really select a provider that has the experience and track record to perform these types of services professionally for you. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about the field service aspect of this, and that would normally involve the installation of devices and also the customer care aspects of that. However, we like to look at it a little bit differently, and that there's a lot of other avenues that you need to think about as you deploy one of these large-scale demand response programs. The first one is really how do you acquire the customers. There's going to be a marketing component here where you actually need to go out either through a direct mail campaign or through outbound calling or door-to-door channels. You need to kind of figure out that overall marketing strategy and how you're actually going to get those customers interested in your program. Once they're interested in the program, you need to have mechanism to enroll them. That could either be through a call center, it could be through a website, it could be through a business reply card. There's a lot of different methods that are currently being used now to enroll customers in these types of programs. Once they are enrolled, you normally would create a work order and complete the installation of that equipment for that customer. There's a customer care component that customers need to be able to call in if there's questions that they need to have addressed. And then once the system is in place, you need to be able to control that system, measure how well it's performing, and then do any additional follow-up beyond that. So it's really more than just installation and customer care. There are other aspects of this that need to be considered. And as you consider that, you need to think about the software systems that need to be in place in order to manage all these different processes and make sure they work together as a system. Next slide, please. So one of the first things you want to do is you want to figure out your field technicians, and the hiring of those field technicians is very critical. I describe it as they are the face of the utility. In many cases, they are going out to customers' homes. They are knocking on doors with thermostat programs. They're going inside the customer's home and installing equipment. And so it's going to be very important that you go through a very structured hiring process, keeping that in mind. And in many cases, vendors will hire HVAC techs to do this type of work. They have some of the skills, but you also want the interpersonal skills as well too as part of that hiring process to make sure that they are customer friendly, they understand the program, what they're offering, they have a neat appearance. Those type things are also just as important as the technical skills. In addition, you need to make sure that you're doing a pretty thorough background check on these technicians as well. That would normally include things like drug testing, obviously background testing, doing some screening of the technicians on the phone before you actually do your face-to-face interviews. And then another one that's extremely important, and we have experience here, is the motor vehicle check, and make sure they have a good driving record. We have interviewed technicians in the past that look great on paper, they had technical skills, but then you pull their driving record, they were horrible. And you don't want somebody with poor driving skills driving around in a van with your company's name on the side of it. So the motor vehicle check is also very, very important in terms of hiring technicians. And then the other thing that both HVAC companies do as well as third-party providers is they like to hire locally. Utilities want to create jobs in their communities, And so when a company like Converge comes in, or other vendors that provide these services, normally they would hire local people, train those people, and those people would actually do the work in your individual service territory. Next slide. So once you have them hired, you want to make sure that they are trained properly. And what we'd recommend is really a series of both classroom training as well as ride-alongs, we call them. And so what we'd like to do is use a modular training approach where the technicians go through a series of modules. They get trained on those modules, and they get tested on each of the modules to make sure they pass that. And those modules include things, obviously like technical training, HVAC background, but it also includes things like program information, how the program is run, what the incentive levels may be, why the utility is actually offering this program. Again, these customers and technicians are interfacing with their customers, and they'll get questions like that from customers when they are actually in the house or at the door. So I think a good series of training is certainly very, very important to these program success, and it needs to be more than just technical training. In addition, many states require that these technicians be licensed. That's normally either an HVAC license or an electrical license, but in virtually all the states that I'm aware of, some type of license is required, and so it's going to be important to make sure that those technicians, are licensed going in, and in addition, they keep their license current. Safety goes without saying, and we'll talk about safety in just a minute here. Safety training is a key aspect of the initial training and also the ongoing training for really any technicians that are supporting these types of programs. And then to evaluate the performance of the technicians, we recommend using a scorecard approach that is used to measure overall performance of the technician to make sure that they are following the guidelines that have been taught in the training classes and that overall meet the utility guidelines as well. Next slide. So I mentioned scorecards. On the right hand of the slide here, this shows a sample scorecard that is used in one of our programs. And for a technician, things that get looked at are things like the courtesy of the technician. Were they pleasant when they arrived at the home? Were they professional? Did they perform the work in a safe manner? Did they understand the program and respond to the questions? Did they take care of the property? Did they not run over any kind of rose bush or damage the customer's property at all? And did they clean up the site when they left? These are things that I think are important in terms of doing a good quality job on a customer's property. Now, there's a couple ways that you can gather this information. One way is where the technician will leave behind a form, if you will, the customer can fill out and mail back to the utility. I personally don't like that method because the technician can obviously not give that form to the customer, only give it out to customers that they think will get a good review on. Really a better way of doing that is to have either a third party or the utility do the follow-up directly with the customer and ask about the overall experience of the technician. That's a much more improved way of doing it, and one way that we recommend that utilities do that. In addition, there are other ways to measure overall customer satisfaction. Obviously, you want satisfaction at the technician level. However, you also want to make sure that your call center is handling calls efficiently. Many call centers have ways of doing satisfaction surveys while the customer is on the call. Those of you like Delta Airlines or others, you're frequently asked, would you like to participate in the survey at the end of this call? And so a lot of call centers will offer that service too. And then if you do get a complaint that comes in from a customer, you want to make sure you have a very well documented process in place to handle that complaint very efficiently and quickly. Next slide. So some of the best practices in terms of the installation itself, we've got a couple things we want to kind of walk through here. One of them is that in many of these programs, the vehicles are actually branded with the utility's name. And it can be anything from a small sign on the side of the vehicle that says authorized contractor for Acme Power. It could be the next sign that's on the truck. Or it could be in some cases where you actually will wrap the entire vehicle with the utility's branding information. This is shown here on the slide, some examples of that. You also want to make sure that your technicians look professional when they show up. We had a guy come to interview one time in an AC/DC shirt, did not make the cut. This is the type of look you want your technician to have khaki pants on, nice shirts on. They will need, obviously, an ID badge as well. And we want the overall look of the technician to be clean, and we want the vehicles to also look clean as well. You also want to have very standardized process and procedures. This should be a repeatable installation process that can be done by any technician, and so having that process documented is also very important. And then following up to make sure the technicians are following that procedure is also critical. We talked about the licensing just a minute ago, but that's also very important and required in most states. In many programs, the utility may have a special safety program they want the techs to go through. For example, we have one client now where all the technicians have to go through their safety program as well as our safety program. So if you either use a local HVAC contractor or use a third-party turnkey provider, you want to make sure that the safety program are in line with those programs the utility is currently also offering or doing for the other programs. Having what I'll call state-of-the-art software and field tools is also important. Again, representing the utility here, you want to make sure that all the data is captured properly and the technicians have the proper tools they need to do their job safely and efficiently. We're also big believers in GPS tracking and that all vehicles have GPS in there for tracking, and Jewel will cover that just a little bit more in just a few minutes here as well too. And then also the quality control procedures is also very, very important to have those in place. So again, these are things that we've seen that are very helpful in making sure that your customer will get a quality installation as part of this program. Next slide, please. So the next thing I'll talk about are mobile field tools. I think the slide's a little slow. There it goes. Historically, a lot of work orders have been done in a paper-based system. When utilities would hire a local contractor to do the work, they may send over a list of work orders to do that work. The HVAC would fill those out and send those back to the utility. We then moved more into some electronic data transfer. And now I think in most modern programs, vendors are going to what I call a mobile field tool. And these are electronic devices that are used to manage the entire work order process. And in many cases, this tool is all done in real time, which is also very important. And the tool also manages the entire process, opening and closing the work order, capturing notes about the visit. If you're installing devices that need to be commissioned, that is also typically built into the mobile field tool. Inventory management to make sure that the inventory on the tech's truck is matching what they actually have. And then the last thing is really a real-time interface. What you want to have is that when the tech completes the work order on a customer site, if that customer calls into the call center 5 minutes later with a question, you want the call center to have that information in front of them showing what was done on site. The other feature that's also very handy that many of the vendors use is you can also attach photos to the work order through this mobile device. And so if you're doing an installation of, say, a switch on an air conditioning unit, you'd probably want to capture a picture of that so that the call center would also have a visual indication in terms of what was done. So the mobile field tools that are currently being used, those are the capabilities you want to look for in your HVAC contractor or your vendor. Next slide. So another thing we recommend in terms of best practice is to make sure that you conduct a thorough pre-inspection before you install the device. I'll talk about ACs. You would go through a similar process with water heaters or other devices, but essentially the last person to touch that unit is the one that owns it, is kind of my phrase I like to use. And so if a customer calls in, they enroll in a program, your tech goes out there and installs the device on an AC unit, and that AC unit breaks the next day, you know who they're calling, and you know who the customer's going to blame for breaking the unit. And so it's very important that you do a thorough inspection before you actually install a device on one of those units. And things we recommend you look for is the age of the unit. If it's a very, very old unit, that's obviously maybe a signal that you may want to install the device. Make sure that the unit is working if you can. You want to turn on, make sure that it's blowing warm air if it's in the summertime. Look for kind of any type of oil leaks that are there. And then you also want to make sure there's a disconnect switch there as well. In most utility programs, if there's no disconnect, then you will normally turn that unit down. And if you do turn down the unit, you want to be able to capture on the work order why that was turned down. Utility companies want to know that information so they can better target their marketing and try to pre-screen customers up front. Next slide. So once you go through the pre-inspection and go through the things we've covered, you would then go through and actually install the device, in this case on the air conditioning unit. As I mentioned, for most programs, there has to be a disconnect on the outdoor unit. That is not code in most states. We do not, at least in our company, and I think most other vendors out there that do this type of work, will not do work if the unit is still hot. So you have to have that disconnect there in order to hook up the device to the unit. You would install the device, make sure that it's working properly. In most cases, there's a commissioning process you go through that you would basically commission the device and verify that it's working properly. The other thing that you should be doing while you're on site is collecting additional data about the equipment. At a minimum, you want to know the tonnage of the unit. You want to know normally the SEER of the unit. In some cases, you may want to collect the fan load amps, the compressor load amps. Anything you can gather about the unit while you're on site is very valuable to the utility when they go back and do their M&V work to validate how much load reduction they're actually getting. So while that tech is on site, make sure you collect as much data as you possibly can about the unit. And then in most cases, the utility will want to have some leave behind materials to thank the customer for being in the program and just information about who to call if they have questions. So that's another thing the tech will normally do is go ahead and leave behind materials for the customer when they leave. Next slide. So I mentioned safety earlier, and maybe I should have covered this first, but really safety is really the most important aspect of program delivery. And for those the utility companies and for those who work with utility companies, whenever you go to a utility meeting, the first thing you normally have is a safety message in that meeting. And so there's a culture you want to create within your technicians that embody that same type of culture you have within a utility company. And so some of the things that we recommend in terms of best practices, first of all, mandatory safety meetings are typically weekly. They're done. You want to make sure that all the proper equipment is provided. Gloves are needed, glasses, safety procedures. Those are all need to be in place as well too. We also like to reward top performers, those technicians who drive without an accident, who have no claims at all. Those are also recognized. Driving, as I mentioned, is a huge issue that you need to kind of work through. We like the Smith system of driving is a very effective tool that you can train your techs on. Most of the techs in our program have been through that type of program. For utility companies, your insurance company can also provide a lot of help there as well and offer free assistance. And then I also mentioned GPS tracking as well is also important. And then the other thing you want to do is you want to set up metrics to track the safety record. The experience modifier rate is a common metric that's being used. It really gauges workman compensation claims and payments to your insurance companies. The most utilities want to see at least a 1 or lower in that particular category. We also like to look at vehicle incident rates. For every million miles driven, how many accidents do the technicians have? Speed violations, GPS tracking can provide reports to you about speeding, which is also very, very helpful. And then things like OSHA rates and accident claims are also important metrics that, as you roll out your program, you want to make sure your vendor has these in place and are adhering to those overall safety standards. Next slide. The last thing I want to cover is inventory management. We like to view inventory as cash. It's value of product sitting in a warehouse somewhere. And in terms of best practices, you want to make sure that you're able to track that inventory through the work order system. And what we mean by tracking is both in terms of where it's physically located. Is it on a premise? Is it on a technician's truck? Is it in a warehouse? And then also the disposition of that inventory. Is it being returned for warranty? Is it been scrapped? And so your system ought to be able to track that as well in terms of inventory location. And the other thing that a lot of companies will do is that they will also try to pre-assemble some of these components in their warehouses before they go out into the field. A real common one is to install what we call whips or conduit onto switches in the warehouse, and then when you get out to the job site, you'll have a better quality installation by having some of that kind of pre-assembled in a controlled environment. So inventory management is something that you may not think about in terms of overall best practices, but it's also a very, very important aspect of running a program successfully. So I'm going to turn this over to Julie Prince. Julie runs our central program support team here, and we have found that having a centralized support program is extremely important for these programs to be successful. And Julie will kind of walk through, the role of that team and kind of things that they do. So Julie, turn it over to you.
Yep, thanks, Robert. So basically, the centralized support team supports 2 groups of customers. We have internal customers which consists of the field office staff, technicians, and the call center. And then we also have external customers, which would consist of the utility company and end users, which would be the homeowners. I'm going to go into a little further details on internal support in the next slide, but just to touch on the external customers, most end user calls are handled by our call center. Robert's going to touch on that just a little bit, but we are basically the second tier support for the end users. We handle escalations, no heat, no air calls. We also speak to those customers for some scheduling. We get directions. If the technicians can't find a home, we'll reach out to the customers for them. And then any questions on specific needs that a customer or a technician would have pertaining to that work order. So that's kind of how we deal with the end users. The volume and the workload for us is definitely seasonal. The start of a heat or cooling season is always going to be a high volume of calls. When people turn on their heat or turn on their air and they have issues, then they'll reach out to us. And then also, of course, during control events. So we have control events and a customer is having issues with their unit, they'll reach out to us and we'll work through that control event to help the customers. Next slide. Thank you. So we feel like having a central support team is extremely beneficial. We're able to handle multiple programs with less headcount. We always have a backup. So if I've got a team member that's on PTO, for example, I have a backup and we work as a team to support each other. So basically there's no downtime. We have found in the past few years that this has been extremely beneficial for us. The main function that we have is technician support. That consists of routing, dispatching, and then handling any technician's needs. So like I said, if we have a technician who can't find a home and they need directions or they have questions on a work order, they'll reach out to us for assistance. They'll also call if they have issues with IntelliSource, which is our customer care system, and again, just handle anything that the technicians would need. Like I spoke about before, we also handle customer emergencies, so Tier 2 support for them. Same day issues that they might have, they need a technician out right away. We would handle all of those, no heat, no air calls, and we're able to use our GPS tracking system to find the nearest technician. So we will give a technician a route each day, and then as those customers call in and have those emergencies, we're able to use our GPS tracking system to find the nearest tech to that customer and route them efficiently. Next slide, please. So just to expand a little bit on our routing process, we use a software that is able to optimize routes, and that's based on appointment type, area of town, and the location of where the tech is going to start. So this allows us to route based on the lowest cost. For example, so if we have a customer who calls in and they have an emergency, we're able to figure out would it be more cost-effective for a tech to drive 10 miles to take care of that emergency, or to drive 2 miles and work overtime. So we're able to really use our system and our GPS tracking system for the best optimized routes. Just to give you an idea of volume that we handled in 2014, this would include installs, repairs, removals, inspections. We handled over 200,000 transactions within my team, so pretty good number there. So I'm going to pass this back over to Robert.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And I had 2 more slides I want to kind of walk through. Julie talked a little bit about call center. And I think for utility companies, you really have 2 choices. In some cases, you may want to use your current call center, have that call center handle customer calls and process those accordingly. There's also, you can outsource that call center work to a dedicated call center, or most of the third-party providers also provide call center services. What this slide is showing is some of the things you want to think about in terms of call center services you want to implement as part of a DR program. Obviously, handling inbound and outbound calls is important. You want to make sure that they can do scheduling of appointments, they have a way of tracking customer calls, and that you really have a dedicated team that are trained on these programs. In many utility call centers, there's such large call volumes coming in. You know, the metric is how many calls can you handle and how quickly can you get that next customer on the line. With these types of programs, you want to really spend a little more time with the customer and answer their questions in detail. So as you look at call center options, here's some things you want to think about in terms of support you may need for a program like this. Next slide. And then the last piece I wanted to mention is just the data exchange, and we could do a whole webinar in terms of data management and reconciliation. But at a high level, when you're working with an HVAC contractor or working with a third-party provider, the utility will need to provide some customer data, a customer's name, address, that type of information. So, you know, that information needs to stay secure, it needs to be transferred in a secure method, and you need to trust that your vendor that you're working with will keep that data secure. When using a contractor or a third-party provider, they'll need to provide back to you work information. You know, what was installed, when was it installed, how was it commissioned, any work order issues. Many utilities want to track that in their own system, and then you need a process in place to handle, you know, reporting between the systems, and then also data reconciliation. So as you evaluate, you know, options for DR programs, do not overlook the importance of data and the amount of time and effort to make sure this data gets exchanged efficiently between your vendor and your utility systems. I'm going to stop now and turn this over to our nuclear scientist here, Pablo. Pablo, you're now on.
Thank you, Robert. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being at the webinar. And I'm going to share with you some details of the Big Partners program that we have at the City of Fort Collins. But before that, I have to show a disclaimer. Next slide, please. As a municipal utility, we partner with many vendors. The City of Fort Collins procurement processes strive to promote a fair and open market, allowing any business's opportunity to compete to satisfy the city's need for goods, services, and construction. We do not endorse or recommend any commercial product, process, service, or manufacturer. Next slide, please. So let me now tell you a bit about Fort Collins. We are located north of Denver, about 1 hour drive north from Denver. Fort Collins Utilities is a multi-commodity utility. We provide electric, water, wastewater, and stormwater services. We are home to Colorado State University, and we also have several high-tech companies in town. As such, we have a higher than average education level in the community, and also we have a much higher rental percentage than at other places. And you have to take that into consideration when you are putting together your plan. I'm going to cover that in a few slides. Next slide, please. So Fort Collins Utilities Light and Power is an electric distribution utility. We are basically an urban environment, pretty dense for the most part. And we purchase power from Platte River Power Authority. Power purchases are 61% of our operating cost, and demand charges are about 40% of the power purchase. The demand charges take the form of a monthly coincident peak charge that is average on the hour. Next, please. So in other words, 25 cents from each dollar we collect goes to pay 1 hour of electricity of each month. So as you can imagine, we do pay a lot of attention to the demand charges when it's such a significant part of our operating cost. Next, please. So when we were designing these programs, I talked to many other utilities and attended conferences. And a pattern that I found is a lot of utilities tend to design programs around a gadget or a specific device that might not fit the end user, the customer needs. So then you find yourself on a square peg in a round hole kind of situation. Next, please. What we did was we consider the customer, the end users, and all the dimensions that they have. So on that graphic, you can see that the peg is both square and round. You just have to make it easier for the customer to participate in the program. And on the next slide, I'm going to explain more about that. Next, please. Thank you. So you might not be surprised that based on my background, I did a lot of analytics before I launched the program. One of the first things we did was we looked at the AMI data, at the hourly data, and we classify all the residential premises based on a DR value, high, medium, low. What I did was I looked at the contribution of each one of those premises to the coincident peak demand charge, and I was trying to find out which premises are the ones that contribute the most. Those are the premises that I want to enroll in the program. Once I did that, then I started to look again through AMI data to the overall load profile of each premise. We also look at different data sources like county assessors to get permits and whatnot. And basically, I was identifying each premise as a good candidate for an HV participation or a good candidate for water heater, electric water heater participation. And then I added another layer. This time I look at the CIS data, and I was looking at these premises that I have already segmented and pre-selected to be the ones enrolled in the program. What is the turnover, the typical turnover? I picked 3 years as a reference point, and I found out that most of the premises that have HVAC have a relatively low turnover, but most of the premises with electric water heater have a very high turnover. This is going back to the rental component that we have in Fort Collins. So when I was looking at this and realizing most of the capacity on electric water heaters is located on rental units with a very high turnover, that was guiding me what kind of communication network I need to use. And we realized that we need to have a cellular network for the electric water heaters, because if we were to use a Wi-Fi electric water heater controller, within 3 years we will have probably lost most of the units or have to dispatch technicians over and over and over again to do the commissioning of the electric water heater with the new customer router that just moved in. So next slide, please. So with all that in consideration, the Peak Partner programs basically offers 2 end devices, thermostats that we choose them to be Wi-Fi, and we target the marketing to those premises that have low customer turnover. We don't exclude anyone from the program, but all our marketing goes towards those premises. And also for electric water heater switches that we are targeting them to multifamily buildings, these ones that tend to be rentals. And what we're doing there from a marketing point of view is, instead of enroll each one of the tenants, we enroll the property management company. That way we have a much more efficient way to enroll participants in the program and build up our capacity. Next slide, please. The program is certainly a demand response program, But we are also delivering energy efficiency and water conservation. For the HVAC customers, we provide them with a programmable thermostat. The thermostat comes with preloaded schedules to match lifestyles. So again, let's try to make things easy for the customer. Let's try to match the shape of the peg to the hole that we are offering to the customer. The other thing that we are doing for the electric water heater customers is when the technician is on the premises doing the installation of the switch, we also have the technician to install insulation on the water heater pipes and to replace the shower heads with low flow shower heads. By doing that, not only we're delivering savings, we're also diminishing the chance of the customer running out of hot water due to a conservation event because we're using low flow shower heads. So we are delivering a better customer experience this way. Next slide, please. So this slide really is meant for those of you in the audience that are people like me, you know, the DR guy of the utility. When you need to deliver a program, you need to take into consideration these factors among others. How are you going to acquire the customer? Which kind of communication channel or channels are you going to use, and who's going to maintain them? What is going to happen with your call center? Are you going to outsource or use your own call center? In our case, we have an almost tenfold increase on calls to our call center during the summer because of people moving in and out. So you need to look at the capacity of your call center before you roll out the program. Field services, Robert Archuli already mentioned all the different factors you need to look at. You just have to think, can you do that on your own? Do you have a staff? Do you have the skills to do it? And then also the end devices. You really need to make sure that the end device is reliable, that the customer experience is going to be a good one, that they will be happy with the device that happens to be on their homes. Next, please. So in our case, given the scope of our program and the time boundaries that we had to do the deployment, we choose to have a single provider to cover all of the above, because by having a single provider, not only we're streamlining processes, again, as I said before, we're increasing customer satisfaction. You just have to look at your particular program and make the decision of what fits the best to you. So with that, back to Robert.
Okay, next slide, please. Thank you very much, Pablo, for your insights. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up here in a minute, but I wanted to provide a couple resources here for the people on the call who might want more information. The first one is a study that was done earlier this year called the California HVAC Contractor and Technician Behavior Study Phase 2. It's a very well written document that kind of lays out the things you should look for using field technicians, both in terms of a third-party vendor as well as using local HVAC. So very informative document, and some of the principles we talked about today were certainly embodied in that particular document as well. But I would encourage, if you want to look at that document, it's available on the internet. It's a very, very thorough, well-written, well-researched document that might be useful. Certainly, Converge website and the Fort Collins website certainly has information as well. And then we've also provided the speaker contact info as well in case you need more information. We had two questions that came in from the field. We want to go ahead and answer quickly. And if you have any questions you would like to submit, please use the chat box on the tool, and we'll try to answer them. The first question we have is tech turnover an issue? And what we found is it really is not an issue. As I mentioned, a lot of these techs come from the HVAC trade, and this is really a pretty good job. They're riding around in an air-conditioned vehicle. They're installing either thermostats inside an air-conditioned home or installing switches on the outside of a home. And, technicians, regular HVAC technicians are working in hot attics a lot of times. They're in crawl spaces. And so this is really a pretty good job for a tech that has HVAC experience. So, you know, we as a company have seen very, very low turnover in our technicians, and I'm assuming that other third-party providers like Converge have probably seen the same. The second question we have is, could you expand a little bit on your safety program? And be happy to do that. We have a program we've implemented that I didn't talk much about called Target Zero. And it's all really based on the belief that really all accidents are preventable and that zero incidents really should be our standard. And with that in mind, we put together an education program that really goes around 5 different areas that we really try to monitor and measure. I mean, the first one is that there are no accidents and no incidents. And again, that we believe these are all preventable through proper training and through proper safety. The second one is no safety violations. We want to make sure that, you know, none of our techs have any type of safety violations of any type. We require that we get 100% completion of online training. We have online training tools we provide, and techs are required to go through at least 1 class a month on the online training. We have a speeding program. Julie mentioned GPS that we're using now for tracking. Those tools will actually send out alerts to supervisors when technicians are speeding, and we have a way of tracking that, and we have seen our speeding come way, way, way down, and so that's another thing that we also look at. And then we also use a driver scorecard as well. So this is all part of what we call our Target Zero campaign for safety. Okay, we have a few more coming in here we're looking at. So the question here is for, I'll maybe let Pablo answer this one. Are you seeing any trends that EE is reducing your DR prospects?
We are trying to understand what is the interaction of EE and DR. We are starting the second summer of the program, so we really don't have good data to support a yes or a no. So the best I can do is I'm looking into that very carefully. Sadly, I don't have an answer yet.
Okay. Thank you, Pablo. We have the question, do you include measurement and verification data collection during implementation as part of DSM? So for us, the answer is yes. In many of our programs, we actually will install M&V equipment for the utility. On one-way systems, installing two-way M&V devices is a pretty common way of measuring overall performance of the system. And in most cases, Converge, as well as many other third-party providers, will certainly be willing to install M&V equipment as part of that overall process. One thing we're seeing, though, is a trend more towards using the AMI data for M&V data validation, if you will. When you have an M&V meter on a home, you can pull that AMI data back and try to look at that data to validate that you're getting the load reduction that you anticipate through the AMI data. So while historically it's been through on-site collection of data through two-way devices, we're seeing a trend now more towards trying to use the AMI data to validate the DR program savings. I think that's all the questions we have. Again, I believe the slides we made available to participants, and I'm going to turn this back over to PJ Energy Central.
Thank you. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending, and speakers, thank you for your presentations. This concludes today's presentation.